The morning of March 4th, 1918, began like every other morning at Camp Funston. Reveille before dawn, men rising in long rows of canvas bunks. The smell of coal smoke and mud and something else. Something that had no name yet. Something that was already moving through the cold Kansas air before anyone had thought to look for it. A cook named Albert Gitchell walked to the camp infirmary. His temperature was 103 degrees Fahrenheit. He told the army doctor he felt feverish. Muscle aches. A headache behind his eyes that would not lift. He said he was sorry to bother them. The doctor recorded his symptoms, gave him aspirin, and sent him to a cot.
By noon, over 100 men from Camp Funston had reported the same complaints. By the end of the week, the number had climbed past 500. Soldiers lay in cots that had been dragged into emergency overflow wards, filling spaces that had been designed for something else. A gymnasium, a dining hall, a hangar that smelled of machine oil. In the photographs from that period, if you look for them, the men do not look frightened. They look inconvenienced. The military doctors were not alarmed. Influenza was a known quantity. It came every winter. It made men miserable for a few days, and then it left. The death rate at Camp Funston in those early weeks was not notably different from any ordinary outbreak.
A handful of men died. The rest recovered. The camp was declared manageable. And here is the first quiet tragedy of what was about to happen. No one raised a flag. No one paused the machinery of war. No one asked what exactly was moving through those barracks and where it had come from, and whether the fact that it appeared in a military camp. A place filled with young men from every corner of the country, men who would soon be loaded onto ships bound for Europe, was something that deserved a longer and more careful look. Because that is how catastrophes begin, not with a warning. With a cot. Camp Funston was not a small installation.
It was one of the largest military training facilities in the United States. At its peak, it held over 56,000 men. It processed soldiers at a rate that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Men arriving by train from Kansas, from Nebraska, from Iowa, and Missouri, and states that had never sent their sons this far from home. Men who had grown up in small towns and on farms, where their immune systems had encountered a different and narrower range of diseases. All of those immune systems, all of those bodies, all of those men, most of them between 18 and 30 years old, about to be compressed into ships and transported across the Atlantic. The men who ran the United States Army in the spring of 1918 were not stupid. They were, in fact, extraordinarily competent by the standards of military logistics in that era. They had built, in a matter of months, a mobilization infrastructure of a scale the country had never attempted. They were moving men and weapons and food and horses and artillery shells across a continent and then across an ocean. And they were doing it with a precision that would have seemed impossible in 1914. But they had a blind spot, as all of us do when we are focused on one enormous problem. The enormous problem they were focused on was the war.
The thing they were not focused on was the kitchen assistant with the headache. The first wave of what history would eventually call the 1918 influenza pandemic was, by the standards of what came next, almost gentle. The case fatality rate was elevated slightly above baseline, but not in a way that disrupted existing mental models. Doctors saw flu. They treated flu. The flu resolved. They moved on. We call it a wave now. At the time, it had no name. It was simply an illness that moved through a camp, then through a port, then onto a ship, then across an ocean. Each transmission so ordinary, so unremarkable, that no one thought to map them.
The most dangerous disasters throughout all of human history have had a habit of beginning with exactly this kind of calm. We do not remember most of the men who were sick at Camp Funston in March of 1918. We do not know their names. Albert Gitchell is recorded because someone thought to note his case, the first in the official registry. But there were hundreds of Gitchells, and then thousands, and they passed through the infirmary and back into the machinery of the war without anyone understanding what they carried. There was a corporal from Abilene. There was a sergeant from Wichita. There was a private who had never been east of Kansas City and would within 3 months be in France.
We do not know which of them were sick in March. We know only that many of them were, and that many of them recovered, and that they boarded the ships anyway. The recovery was the part that mattered, because the men who recovered did not know they had been carrying something forward with them. They had been sick, and then they had been well, and being well felt like an ending. It was not an ending. It was a passage, a brief, invisible handoff between the plains of Kansas and the ports of Brittany, carried without ceremony in the ordinary act of breathing, carried in the lungs of young men who had no idea they were history's couriers. A virus does not need to be noticed to travel.
It does not need permission. It does not wait for a declaration or a medical conference or a government committee to conclude that action is warranted. It simply moves from breath to breath, from hand to surface to hand again, from the man sleeping in the bunk above you to the man sleeping in the bunk below, from the soldier boarding the ship to the soldier already aboard who had been well yesterday. By the time anyone thought to ask where it had begun, it had already been somewhere else for a very long time.
The disease would come to be called the Spanish flu. This was not accurate. It was not remotely accurate. But accuracy, in the middle of a world war, was something that governments had decided they could not afford. In 1918, most of the major warring nations, France, Britain, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the United States, had enacted wartime censorship laws. The logic was simple and terrible. Public morale was a military resource. A population that believed it was winning, or at least surviving, was a population that would continue to buy war bonds and send sons to the front and work 12-hour shifts in munitions factories.
Anything that suggested weakness, suffering, or mass death on the home front was a threat to that belief, and therefore a threat to be suppressed. Influenza spreading through military camps and factory towns and the crowded apartments of industrial cities was exactly the kind of story that wartime censors wanted buried. And buried it was. Newspapers that reported on the illness were fined or shut down. Commanders who wrote honestly about sick rates in their units found those dispatches intercepted. The word itself, epidemic, was, in several countries, functionally banned from official communication. Spain was neutral.
Spain had no censorship of this kind, or rather, Spain's censors were focused on different concerns, and a respiratory illness that was making the rounds in Madrid was not, from the perspective of the Spanish government, a secret worth keeping. When influenza began moving through the capital in the spring of 1918, the Spanish press reported it openly and in considerable detail. King Alfonso XIII fell ill. His prime minister fell ill. Members of the royal court fell ill. The newspapers named names, described symptoms, published the numbers. The wire services picked up the dispatches and transmitted them to London and Paris and New York.
The rest of the world, reading those dispatches and having nothing comparable from their own censored press, drew a natural conclusion. The disease had originated in Spain. The name stuck. Spanish flu. La gripe española. La gripe española. It was printed on posters and written into official correspondence and embedded in the medical literature of the time, and it persisted for a century, even after it was known to be false. Spain had not invented this illness. Spain had simply told the truth about it. And truth, in 1918, was a sufficiently unusual act that the world mistook it for origin.
The real question, where did this virus actually begin, has occupied scientists and historians for more than a century, and it remains, in its precise details, unresolved. What we have instead are three competing hypotheses, each supported by real fragments of evidence, each with its own advocates and its own weaknesses, each revealing something different about the way human institutions respond to catastrophe. The American hypothesis points to Camp Funston and to the broader context of the United States military mobilization in early 1918. The date is consistent. The scale of the installation and the volume of human bodies moving through it are consistent. The pattern of early spread tracks closely with the documented movement of American troops to European ports.
Jeffrey Taubenberger, a pathologist at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, spent years reconstructing the 1918 virus from fragments of preserved tissue, lung samples from soldiers who had died in 1918, stored in formalin for decades in the Institute's archives. In 1997, his team extracted RNA sequences from those samples. In 2005, working with samples recovered from an Alaskan woman who had been buried in the permafrost since 1918. Her body preserved in the frozen ground of Breivik Mission in a way that kept the virus intact, Taubenberger published the complete genomic reconstruction of the 1918 strain. What the genome revealed was that this was an H1N1 influenza A virus with deeply unusual characteristics.
It was not simply a human influenza virus. Its surface proteins, the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase that the immune system uses to recognize and respond to influenza, were structurally unlike anything that had been circulating in the human population in the preceding decades. They showed a strong affinity with avian influenza viruses. The 1918 strain appeared to be a bird flu that had somehow acquired the ability to transmit efficiently between humans, a jump of extraordinary immunological significance because it meant that the entire human population of the Earth had no prior immunity to it at all. But there is another hypothesis, developed by the British virologist John Oxford and published in 1999.
Oxford's argument pointed not to Kansas, but to France, specifically to the British military camp at Etaples, located near the English Channel in northern France, which served as a massive transit and hospital facility during the war. What made Etaples unusual in Oxford's analysis was the combination of humans and animals in close proximity. The camp had pig farms and poultry operations operating alongside the barracks, feeding the enormous population of soldiers passing through. Pigs are what virologists sometimes call a mixing vessel. They can be infected by both human and avian influenza strains, and when two different influenza viruses infect the same pig cell simultaneously, they can exchange genetic material and produce entirely new combinations.
Medical records from Atoplo dating back to 1916 described a severe and unusual respiratory illness, one with hemorrhagic features, meaning the lungs bled internally, a characteristic that would later be recognized as distinctive of the 1918 strain. Oxford argued that the virus had been circulating in a less virulent form for at least 2 years before Camp Funston saw its first cases in March of 1918. That Gitchell was not a beginning, he was a visible surfacing. And then there is a third hypothesis, more contested and more uncomfortable for reasons that have little to do with science.
During the war, the British and French relied heavily on laborers recruited from China. The Chinese Labor Corps, 200,000 men brought across the Pacific and through Canada, transported under conditions of strict quarantine in sealed rail cars, deployed to dig trenches, haul supplies, unload ships, and bury the dead. In the winter of 1917 and early 1918, Canadian quarantine records noted a severe respiratory illness moving through these workers during their passage across the country. Some historians have suggested this illness may have been an early form of the pandemic strain. The hypothesis was revived by Mark Humphreys in 2014, based on newly discovered archival sources in China and Canada. He was careful to note the limits of his evidence.
Others have been less careful, and the hypothesis has been used in various periods to support arguments about immigration and contagion that have nothing to do with epidemiology. The science behind the Chinese origin hypothesis is thinner than the science behind either the American or French theories. But the archival records exist. The question of where exactly this virus crossed from an animal reservoir into the human population has not been definitively answered. What Taubenberger's reconstruction confirmed, regardless of which geographic origin we accept, was the nature of the threat. The 1918 H1N1 strain was genuinely novel. There was no partial immunity built from previous exposure.
There was no population on Earth, not in the industrial cities of Europe, not in the villages of rural India, not in the islands of the Pacific, not in the frozen North, that had any meaningful biological defense. This is why even the mild first wave infected so many people so quickly. The virus was not in its spring form exceptionally lethal, but it was exceptionally capable of spreading, because there was nothing anywhere in the world's immune systems to slow it down. Wars are usually blamed on specific acts. A shot in Sarajevo, a crossed border, a broken treaty. The 1918 pandemic has no such moment.
It has 3 competing origin stories, and a genome that points toward birds and a name borrowed from a country that had nothing to do with it, and a truth that took decades of forensic science to begin to assemble. It did not need to know where it came from. It only needed to move.
In the spring and summer of 1918, the United States was sending soldiers to Europe at a rate of approximately 10,000 men per day. Think about that number for a moment. 10,000 men every single day, loaded onto troop transports, ships that had been converted from passenger liners or cargo vessels, their interiors stripped and refitted with tiered bunks, their decks crowded with equipment and ammunition, and the endless logistics of a war being fought 4,000 miles away. The men were packed into those spaces at a density that would have been alarming under any other circumstances. Bunks stacked 3 and 4 high, communal mess halls where hundreds ate in rotation, shared latrines, shared air. A single infected man, breathing in a space that held 500 others, could theoretically expose every one of them before the ship cleared the harbor. The crossings took 7 to 14 days. By the time the transports docked at Liverpool, or Brest, or Southampton, whatever was circulating in those holds had had more than enough time to pass through every lung aboard. The military understood, in a general way, that disease traveled with armies. This was not a new concept. In the American Civil War, more soldiers had died of diarrheal disease than of enemy fire. In the Boer War, typhoid had been more dangerous than bullets.
The medical services attached to modern armies had been built in large part in response to those lessons. Vaccination programs, sanitation protocols, field hospital systems designed to isolate the wounded from the sick. But respiratory illness was different. Airborne transmission, the passage of virus particles in exhaled breath, suspended in the air, breathed in by the next person before they settled, was still only partially understood in 1918. The influenza virus itself had not yet been isolated or identified as a virus. Most physicians still believed influenza was caused by a bacterium, Pfeiffer's bacillus, that had been identified during an earlier epidemic.
The idea that something smaller than a bacterium, something that could pass through the finest filters available, was circulating through the troop transports of the United States Navy was not part of the conceptual framework available to the men making decisions about who boarded which ship. By April and May of 1918, the first wave had reached the Western Front on both sides of the line. British units reported fever and respiratory illness moving through their ranks. French troops reported the same. And then, documented in the records of the German High Command in a way that would later be cited in post-war military inquiries, German troops reported it too.
Erich Ludendorff, the German general who had designed and directed the Great Spring Offensives of 1918, wrote in his post-war memoirs that the influenza had played a significant role in undermining the fighting capacity of his forces at a critical moment. The Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, the massive offensive launched in March to break through Allied lines before American forces could arrive in sufficient numbers to tip the balance, had come achingly close to succeeding. German forces had advanced further in a single day than either side had managed in years of trench warfare. And then the momentum stalled. Ludendorff attributed part of the failure to his soldiers being too sick to exploit the breakthroughs they had achieved.
Battalions that were supposed to pour through gaps in the Allied line found themselves reduced by illness, their men feverish and exhausted, unable to move at the pace the operational plan required. There is something deeply strange in this detail. The virus that had started in an American training camp, or perhaps in a French military staging ground, or perhaps in a Chinese labor column, was now affecting the outcome of battles on the Western Front. The same pathogen was simultaneously burning through the armies that were trying to kill each other. It had no allegiance. It did not read the casualty reports or follow the strategic maps.
The trenches and the ships and the rail lines that were moving men and weapons and supplies across a continent were also, without anyone's knowledge or consent, serving as the infrastructure of a biological event that would ultimately kill more people than the war itself. War concentrates human bodies. It puts hundreds of thousands of men in close proximity under conditions of stress, sleep deprivation, cold, poor nutrition, and compromised sanitation. All of those conditions depress immune function. All of them make respiratory transmission faster and more complete. The war had built, for military purposes, the most efficient engine for spreading an airborne pathogen that had ever existed. It used that engine thoroughly.
By the late summer of 1918, the first wave had largely subsided across Europe and North America. Hospitals returned to something approaching normal capacity. Men who had been sick in May were back at their posts in July. The death tolls from the spring outbreak, while elevated above baseline, were not catastrophic by the standards of a conflict that had already produced Verdun and the Somme. The consensus that formed, in military headquarters, in government ministries, in the medical literature to the extent it was being discussed, was that the worst had passed. An unusual influenza season, they told themselves. Unpleasant, manageable, over. This consensus was one of the most consequential errors in the history of medicine.
Not because the people who held it were foolish, but because the evidence available to them in August of 1918 genuinely supported it. The first wave had subsided. The hospitals were quieter. There was no obvious reason, from inside that moment, to anticipate what was coming. But in the places where the virus had gone, in the crowded field hospitals of France, in the troop ships crossing back and forth across the Atlantic, in the port cities of West Africa and South Asia, where global shipping routes intersected, it was not subsiding. It was changing. RNA viruses replicate with extraordinary speed and extraordinary imprecision. Every replication cycle introduces errors. Most errors are neutral or harmful to the virus.
But occasionally, very occasionally, an error produces something that works better than what was there before. And in an environment with hundreds of millions of simultaneous replication events, which is what you have when a novel influenza virus is sweeping through an immunologically naive human population of nearly 2 billion, the probability of useful mutations from the virus's perspective is not small. The summer of 1918 was not a pause. It was a laboratory, and the experiment running inside it was one that no human institution had authorized and no human institution could stop.
In the last week of August 1918, 3 places on opposite sides of the Earth reported a new and sharply different illness almost simultaneously. In Boston, Massachusetts, sailors at Commonwealth Pier began arriving at sickbay with symptoms unlike anything their doctors had seen from the spring wave. The fever came on faster, within hours rather than days. The headache and the muscle pain were more severe. And some of the men, a percentage that immediately alarmed the attending physicians, were developing something beyond the standard influenza picture. Their lips were turning blue. Their breathing became labored and then desperate within hours of symptom onset.
Their lungs filled with fluid in a pattern that the physicians, reaching for language they didn't quite have, described as resembling drowning from the inside. The first death at Commonwealth Pier came on August 28th. More followed within days. By the end of the first week of September, the Boston City Hospital had recorded cases in the hundreds. By the end of the second week, the city was in crisis. In Brest, the French Atlantic port through which hundreds of thousands of American soldiers had been flowing all summer, French and American military doctors reported an identical pattern appearing at almost exactly the same moment, the same sudden onset, the same rapid respiratory deterioration.
The same bluish discoloration, cyanosis, in the lips and fingertips of the most severely ill, indicating that the blood was no longer carrying sufficient oxygen to the body's tissues. Soldiers who had been healthy at morning roll call were dead before midnight. The hospital at Brest was overwhelmed within days. A doctor named Victor Vaughan, one of the most prominent physicians in the United States Army Medical Corps, arrived in Devens, Massachusetts, a camp that was reporting the same symptoms as Boston in early September. He wrote afterward that he saw men laid out in rows, most of them young, most of them previously healthy, with the characteristic mahogany-colored spots spreading across their cheekbones and the cyanosis spreading from their lips outward.
He wrote that if the epidemic continued at its current rate, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth within a matter of weeks. Vaughan was not given to exaggeration. He was an experienced military physician who had seen epidemic disease before. What he saw in September of 1918 was something outside his existing categories. In Freetown, Sierra Leone, a British colonial port on the West African coast, one of the nodes in the global shipping network that connected the British Empire. The harbor was crowded with vessels that had stopped to take on coal before continuing to their next destinations. Something was spreading through the dock workers and through the crews of the ships.
The colonial medical officer filed a report noting a respiratory illness of unusual severity and unusual speed. He noted that men who were well in the morning were dead by the following morning. He noted that the deaths were not following the expected pattern, not the very old, not the very young, but the men in the middle, the working men, the men upon whom the operation of the port depended. 3 locations, 3 different continents, 3 different populations, American sailors, French port workers, West African dock laborers, with no contact with each other. The same August. The same new virus. Epidemiologists who have studied this convergence for decades have concluded that the most likely explanation is not simultaneous independent emergence in 3 places.
The most likely explanation is that the new variant had already been circulating for some period, perhaps weeks, perhaps months, in less monitored settings, in the field hospitals of the Western Front, where the sheer volume of patients may have obscured the signal, on the ships moving constantly between European and American ports, where deaths at sea were not always formally recorded, in communities that lacked the medical infrastructure to characterize what was killing their people. The 3 August outbreaks in Boston and Brest and Freetown were not the birth of the second wave. They were the moment when it became impossible to ignore.
What made this variant so different from what had circulated in the spring came down to a specific and terrible mechanism that no physician in 1918 had the conceptual tools to name. When the influenza virus enters the respiratory tract, the immune system begins to respond. It deploys neutrophils and macrophages, white blood cells that engulf and destroy infected cells. It releases cytokines, signaling proteins that coordinate the immune response, calling reinforcements to the site of infection, raising the body's core temperature to create conditions inhospitable to viral replication. increasing the permeability of blood vessels so that immune cells can move more quickly into affected tissue. In most flu infections, this process runs its course and resolves. The 1918 autumn variant in a significant subset of patients triggered something that did not resolve. The cytokine response did not calibrate to the scale of the infection. It escalated in a self-reinforcing loop, more cytokines calling more immune cells, which destroyed more infected tissue, and released more cytokines, which called more immune cells. The feedback had no natural off switch. The immune system, marshalling its full resources against the virus, began destroying the tissue of the lungs at a rate that the lungs could not survive. Fluid accumulated in the alveoli, the tiny air sacs through which oxygen passes from the breath into the bloodstream. As those sacs filled, the patient's ability to oxygenate their blood declined.
The blue discoloration that physicians were noting in the lips and fingertips was the visible sign of a body slowly suffocating in air, its lungs present and functioning in the mechanical sense, but no longer capable of performing their fundamental task. Doctors called it pneumonia. Some of it was secondary bacterial pneumonia, opportunistic infections, establishing themselves in damaged lung tissue. But some of it was something else, something that was the direct consequence of the immune response itself, something that had no name in 1918 and would not be called cytokine storm for many decades. The normal mortality curve for influenza is shaped like a U. The very young and the very old are most vulnerable.
Young adults, people between 20 and 40 in the full health of their immune systems, occupy the lowest risk part of the curve. They get sick. They are miserable for a week. They recover. The autumn wave of 1918 drew a W instead, or rather it pushed the middle of the U upward, adding a third peak of mortality precisely in the group that should have been safest. The highest death rates outside of infants and the elderly were concentrated in adults between 20 and 40 years old. The mechanism was the one described above. A robust immune system encountering this variant was more likely to produce a catastrophic cytokine cascade than a compromised one. The very competence of the immune response became its lethality.
The body was fighting the virus with every tool evolution had given it, and the fight was destroying the body. This is why the military lost disproportionate numbers of its most physically fit soldiers. This is why factories found their healthiest workers dying while the older supervisors survived. This is why families that had watched a young husband and wife through the spring wave now watch them die in October. The people the war had been fought to protect, the people the economy required to function, the people whose children were waiting for them to come home. There is a quality of profound wrongness to this mechanism that resists easy philosophical accommodation.
We are accustomed, when we think about vulnerability to disease, to thinking of weakness as the risk factor. We understand that the very old and the very young are fragile. We understand that poverty and malnutrition and crowding increase susceptibility. We build those assumptions into our public health systems and our intuitive models of risk. The 1918 virus inverted this. The strongest were not protected by their strength. They were, in a terrible and specific sense, undone by it. The body's defenses, refined across millions of years of evolutionary pressure, became, against this one pathogen, in this one season, the very instrument of death. The stronger you were, the harder you fought.
The harder you fought, the more completely you destroyed the tissue you could not live without. The second wave moved with a speed that overwhelmed every institutional response attempted against it. Within weeks of the August detections in Boston and Brest and Freetown, it had spread through the eastern seaboard of the United States, across the British Isles, through France, and into every country the war had touched. By October, it was in every major city in North America and Europe. By November, it had reached South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Pacific Islands, the high Arctic. It followed the same roads and rails and shipping lanes that the first wave had followed. The same infrastructure, the same routes.
But with a velocity and a case fatality rate that had not been present in the spring, and that nothing the public health systems of 1918 had been designed to address. The governments that had suppressed reporting of the spring wave now faced something they could not suppress, because the hospitals were too full and the bodies too numerous and the sick too visibly everywhere to maintain the fiction that nothing was happening.
The world that had spent 4 years absorbing and rationalizing and learning to metabolize unprecedented mass death. The mud and the artillery and the names in the newspapers, the telegrams to families, the casualty figures that no one could fully comprehend, was about to discover that even by those terrible standards, this was something it had not prepared for. The second wave was not the same disease. It was something that had learned, between spring and autumn, how to kill the young and the strong. The second wave was not the same disease. It was something that had learned, between spring and autumn, how to kill the young and the strong.
There is a photograph taken on September 28, 1918, on Broad Street in Philadelphia. You cannot count the people in it. They press together like water filling a vessel, shoulder to shoulder, hat brim to hat brim, stretching back until the street dissolves into a solid mass of human bodies. Estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000. Historians still argue about the precise count. What no one argues about is what happened next. The event was called the Liberty Loan Drive Parade. It was a patriotic procession organized to sell war bonds, to fill the treasury, to keep the boys in France supplied with ammunition and boots and morphine. The bands had been rehearsing for weeks.
The floats had been constructed and decorated with patriotic colors. Sailors and Marines had polished their buttons and pressed their uniforms. City officials had printed programs and distributed them. Vendors had set up along the route. The mayor was expected to speak, and the virus had already been in Philadelphia for 3 weeks. By late September of 1918, the second wave had established itself. Navy sailors at the Philadelphia Navy Yard had begun dying in clusters. Local hospitals were filling faster than they could discharge patients. A physician named Wilmer Cruzen, who served as the city's director of public health, had received letters. Formal medical letters, written on hospital stationery, signed by senior physicians, urging him to cancel the parade. The warnings were not vague.
They cited case counts. They cited the rate of increase. They cited what had already happened in Boston, where the second wave had arrived in late August, and filled Massachusetts General Hospital within weeks and spilled into the streets. Cruzen read those letters. He consulted with colleagues. He attended meetings. He considered the situation. And then he did not cancel the parade. The historical record does not give us a clean villain. Cruzen was not ignorant. He was not, by all accounts,
malicious, or corrupt.
He was a man entangled in pressures that pulled in multiple directions at once. The war effort and its financial requirements, civic morale in a city exhausted by years of wartime sacrifice, the economic machinery of bond sales that needed public enthusiasm to function, and the political cost of appearing to panic at a moment when the federal government was actively discouraging public expressions of alarm about anything that might weaken the home front's resolve. He made a calculation. Reasonable people, given the same pressures, might have made the same calculation. The calculation was catastrophically wrong.
Approximately 200,000 people stood in the autumn air of Philadelphia on September 28, 1918, and watched the bands march past and cheered for the floats and the sailors and the bonds and the idea of victory. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was occupied. Within a week, the emergency hospitals, hastily assembled in churches, in school gymnasiums, in commandeered warehouse spaces, and unused factory floors, were also full.
By October 4th, the same wards were receiving 4 times their capacity. By October 7th, physicians stopped writing descriptions in the admission notes because there was no longer time to write descriptions. Within 2 weeks, Philadelphia recorded 4,597 deaths in a single week. 4,597 in one city, in 7 days. The coffin supply ran out. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Philadelphia's coffin manufacturers could not produce boxes at the rate the city was generating bodies. Undertakers were overwhelmed within days of the parade, and then the undertakers themselves began falling sick. Because undertakers in 1918 worked without protective equipment and the bodies they handled were still infectious. Bodies accumulated in homes.
Families kept their dead in back rooms, in parlors, on porches covered with sheets, waiting for collection that was delayed by days, and then by more days. The city government contacted the Pennsylvania Railroad and asked whether the company could provide flatbed rail cars for body transport. The railroad said yes. Priests drove through neighborhoods in the mornings, calling out for anyone who needed last rites, because the dying were too numerous and too widely distributed for the churches to track. Gravediggers worked around the clock and still fell behind. City officials eventually recruited incarcerated men from the local jail to dig graves, because that was the only remaining labor pool large enough to absorb the work.
A Mailhoot Department worker named Howard Anders wrote in his report that he visited a neighborhood on October 9th where he found bodies in 8 consecutive houses on a single block. Not one body per house, multiple bodies. He described the smell. He described the children in one house who had apparently been trying to care for their dead parents and did not fully understand what had happened. He wrote the report in flat bureaucratic language and filed it, as people who see too much learn to do. 500 miles to the west, in the same weeks, the city of St. Louis was living a different October. St. Louis had a different public health commissioner.
His name was Max Starkloff, and when the second wave began its approach in mid-September,
Starkloff did not wait. He moved before the disease was visibly present in large numbers. He closed schools on October 5th, a day before the city's case count would have triggered alarm under any reasonable threshold. He closed churches the same day. He closed theaters, dance halls, pool halls, saloons, bowling alleys. He banned public gatherings of more than 20 people. He required anyone displaying symptoms to remain home. He instituted a system of household inspection. The residents of St. Louis did not all approve. There were complaints.
There were newspaper editorials questioning whether the closures were necessary, whether Starkloff was overreacting, whether the economic cost of shutting down the city's public life was proportionate to a threat that many people, as of early October, had not personally witnessed. Some business owners objected loudly. Some church leaders objected on theological grounds: the need to gather, to pray together, to minister to the sick. Starkloff maintained the restrictions through October and into November. The results were measurable and stark. St. Louis recorded approximately 358 deaths per 100,000 residents during the peak pandemic period. Philadelphia recorded approximately 748 per 100,000 during the same period. Not a small difference. Not the difference between bad and slightly less bad.
Approximately half the death rate. Thousands of people in St. Louis were alive in November who would not have been alive if their city had made Philadelphia's choices. This comparison became one of the most studied cases in the entire history of public health. Epidemiologists returned to the Philadelphia-St. Louis contrast repeatedly in the decades that followed. When AIDS required thinking about behavioral interventions, when SARS required thinking about quarantine logistics, when a new coronavirus began spreading from a wet market in Wuhan in the final weeks of 2019. The lesson the comparison offered was always the same. The timing of intervention matters more than almost anything else.
An action taken before the wave arrives is worth 10 times the same action taken after the wave has broken. By the time you can see what is coming, you are already too late to prevent most of what is coming. This is not an intuitive lesson. It requires decision-makers to act against visible evidence, to close schools when schools appear safe, to restrict gatherings when gatherings appear harmless, to impose costs in the present against a threat that has not yet fully materialized. It requires a kind of political courage that is difficult to sustain in a democracy where today's costs are visible and tomorrow's benefits are hypothetical. It requires trusting models over experience, which is a difficult thing to ask of any person or any institution.
1918 demonstrated this with arithmetic that cannot be argued with. Wilmer Cruson had experience. He had a city that appeared, as of late September, to be managing the disease. He had bond quotas to fill and parade committees that had been planning for months, and a national government pushing back against anything that looked like defeatism. Max Starkloff had a model and a willingness to act on it before the evidence was overwhelming. The difference in October dead between those two cities is the cost of the gap between those two approaches to risk. Wilmer Cruson was not charged with any crime. He continued to serve as Philadelphia's health commissioner through the remainder of the pandemic. He made public statements expressing grief at the city's losses.
He noted, correctly, that no one could have fully predicted the severity of what occurred. He was not wrong that the certainty available to him in late September was less than the certainty available to historians examining his decisions a century later. He is remembered as a footnote.
The 4,597 of that single October week are recorded in databases. They do not have a monument on Broad Street.
In normal times, a hospital ward has a rhythm. Nurses move at particular speeds determined by long institutional practice. Charts are updated at specific intervals. Medications are dispensed on schedules refined over years and written into protocols and memorized by staff who have performed these actions hundreds of times. The dying die in beds with white sheets, attended by someone who knows their name and their chart number and what they were admitted for. The dead are moved quietly, with a practiced care that has been developed not only for efficiency, but for the dignity of the living who remain.
October 1918 ended that rhythm in hundreds of hospitals across the United States, Britain, France, Germany, South Africa, Australia, and every other country the war had touched and the flu reached. What replaced it was something closer to battlefield triage, but without the clarity of a battlefield, where the wound is visible and its severity at least partially accessible from the outside. In a military field hospital, the surgeon knows whether the fragment is in the chest or the leg. In a flu ward in Philadelphia or Boston or Chicago in the autumn of 1918, the patient walked in looking feverish and unremarkable, and within 12 to 24 hours might be drowning in their own lungs, while their skin turned a color that had no comfortable name.
The cyanosis was what the nurses remembered. The word is clinical, derived from the Greek for dark blue, and it does not quite capture what it described. In severe cases of the 1918 influenza, the disruption to oxygen exchange in the lungs was so profound that patients' blood could not carry sufficient oxygen to the body's tissues. The skin responded. It turned. Not the blue-gray of a bruise, but a deeper, more absolute color. The color of lips on a very cold day, but distributed across the entire face, and then the hands, and then further, the whole body darkening as oxygen depletion progressed. Physicians had a term for the most extreme presentation.
They called it heliotrope cyanosis, after a flower, as if the naming were a way of making the thing less strange, of placing it in the catalogue of understood phenomena. The nurses who worked those wards and survived to give oral histories decades later, when historians began systematically interviewing pandemic survivors, described the color more than almost anything else. They remembered the sounds too. The particular wet quality of the cough, the sound of labored breathing in a ward where many people were breathing laboriously at once, a sound one nurse described as the ward itself breathing. They remembered the smell, which was the smell of illness in concentrated quantity. But they came back again and again to the color. The hospitals did not have enough beds.
That was the first problem, and it was unsolvable in any short time frame, because beds require frames and mattresses and linens and space, and all of those things have lead times. The second problem was that the medical staff were dying. Nurses contracted the influenza at rates that reflected their working conditions. Close contact with infectious patients, prolonged exposure in enclosed wards, shifts that could extend to 14 or 16 hours because the staff shortages created by sick nurses created pressure on the remaining nurses to work longer. No protective equipment existed in any meaningful sense. Masks made of gauze were available and used, but the gauze masks of 1918 were not fitted, not sealed, not tested for filtration efficiency. They offered some protection.
They did not offer adequate protection against a virus spread by respiratory droplets in the volumes generated by a ward full of severely ill patients. Hospitals that entered October with full nursing complements found themselves in mid-October with a third of their nursing staff incapacitated or dead. Emergency appeals went to nursing schools. Student nurses in their first or second year of training were assigned to wards and given instructions that amounted to: observe, assist. Do not make things worse. Medical schools were contacted and final year students were granted early provisional credentials and sent to work before they had completed their training.
A medical student at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia described in his memoir arriving on the ward on his first day and finding that the attending physician he had expected to report to had been admitted as a patient the previous evening. There was no antiviral medication. That fact requires emphasis because we have come to assume in the 21st century that medicine has tools for every category of threat, even if those tools are imperfect. In 1918, there were no antivirals because viruses were barely understood. The influenza virus would not be identified until 1933. In 1918, medicine did not know with certainty whether influenza was caused by a virus or a bacterium.
A prominent theory held that it was caused by Pfeiffer's bacillus, a bacterium that was found in many flu patients' respiratory secretions. Treatments based on this theory, serums developed against the bacterium, were administered widely and had no effect on the disease because they were targeting the wrong organism. There were no antibiotics. Penicillin was a decade away. This matters because many of the deaths in 1918 flu patients were caused not directly by the virus, but by secondary bacterial pneumonia. Infections that followed in the wake of a respiratory system compromised by the viral attack. In the 21st century, these secondary infections are treatable.
In 1918, they were frequently fatal, and they were, by some analyses, responsible for a significant fraction of the total death toll. Physicians offered supportive care, fluids, rest, aspirin for fever, oxygen where oxygen was available, which in many hospitals in 1918 was not consistently available. Some physicians administered whiskey, following traditions older than germ theory. Some administered strychnine in small doses, following a medical fashion of the era for tonic stimulants. Some administered camphor. The treatments were mostly ineffective and occasionally counterproductive, not through negligence, but through the genuine limits of what was known. The aspirin is worth pausing on specifically. In 1918, Bayer's patent on aspirin had expired, and aspirin was manufactured in large quantities by multiple companies.
It was widely understood to reduce fever, which was correct, and was recommended by the United States Surgeon General in doses that we now recognize as potentially dangerous. The recommended dose in some 1918 medical guidelines was 8 to 30 grams per day. The maximum safe daily dose recognized today is approximately 4 grams. At very high doses, aspirin can cause pulmonary edema, fluid accumulation in the lungs, and this is one of the symptoms the 1918 flu was most notorious for producing. Some medical historians have argued that a meaningful fraction of deaths attributed to the 1918 influenza were accelerated or directly caused by aspirin toxicity administered in clinical settings by physicians following official guidance. We cannot determine, at this remove, how many. The records do not allow that level of decomposition. What we can say is that physicians acting in good faith, following the best available recommendations, may have inadvertently made some patients worse. Medicine is always partly the history of good faith errors made at the edge of what is known. The virus spread through families with a logic that felt personal and targeted, though it was only statistical. A family of 5, in which one member fell sick in October of 1918, did not have the option of quarantine in any meaningful modern sense. There were no spare rooms in the average working-class household. There were no separate bathrooms. There were no masks in the medicine cabinet. The sick person lay in the shared bedroom, in the shared bed in many cases, and coughed through the night. And the family members who cared for them breathed the same air and touched the same surfaces and shared the cups and the towels and the basin of water brought for the fever. The virus moved through families in sequences that could feel methodical. One child sick on Monday, the mother who nursed that child sick by Wednesday, the father who had seemed fine through Thursday dead by Sunday. Or the opposite sequence. The parents gone first, leaving children who ranged from old enough to be frightened and not know what to do to young enough not to understand what the stillness in the next room meant.
Social welfare organizations in American cities attempted to track the orphan situation in the autumn of 1918 and largely failed, because the record-keeping systems of the era were not designed for this volume of simultaneous family dissolution. A rough accounting conducted by the Red Cross in late 1918 estimated tens of thousands of children left without both parents in a matter of weeks across American cities. The estimate was acknowledged to be incomplete. A visiting nurse named Lillian Wald, who ran the Henry Street settlement on Manhattan's Lower East Side, kept records of the home visits her nurses made during October of 1918.
The entries describe a sequential dismantling of households. A family visited on Tuesday with one sick adult, revisited on Thursday to find 2 more sick, and the first one worse. Revisited again the following Tuesday to find the first one dead, and the question of what to do with the remaining children now urgent. Wald's records contain hundreds of these sequences. She published some of them in a report to the city. The report was read by officials who had limited resources to respond. Every death in that autumn was surrounded by concentric rings of damage extending outward. The person who died was one number accounted for in the mortality records. The family fractured around that death was not counted anywhere. The children who grew up without a parent.
The spouse who spent the 1920s in the particular grief of someone widowed not by an enemy, but by a pathogen that no one could hold responsible. A grief that had no socially sanctioned form, no ritual adequate to it, no monument against which to place flowers. The economic consequences that rippled outward when a breadwinner died, and the household income collapsed, and the surviving parent was forced into decisions about which children could be kept and which might need to be placed. Statistics count the dead. They do not count what dying takes with it when it goes.
There is a temptation when studying the 1918 pandemic through an American lens to treat it as primarily an American story. The Camp Funston origin, the Liberty Loan Parade, the Philadelphia death toll. These are the images that appear in American textbooks, in American documentaries, in the American popular imagination of the pandemic. They are real. They are significant. But they are a narrow window, and what lies outside the frame of that window is larger than what is inside it. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed more people in India alone than it killed in Europe and North America combined. British India in 1918 had a population of approximately 300 million.
Historians and epidemiologists have spent decades attempting to reconstruct the death toll, working from fragmentary colonial records, census data, mortality surveys, local government reports filed in dozens of languages and administrative systems, many of them incomplete and some of them deliberately underreported, because colonial administrators had institutional incentives to minimize the appearance of crisis in the territories they administered. The estimates range widely, and the range itself is significant. The most conservative serious estimates begin at 12 million dead. More recent analyses, applying improved demographic modeling techniques to newly examined historical records, suggest the true figure was between 17 and 20 million. Some analyses with different methodological assumptions push the estimate higher still. Even at the lower bound, the magnitude is almost impossible to hold in ordinary thought.
12 million people is more than the population of London in 1918. 20 million is more than the total military and civilian dead of the First World War. And this was one colonial territory, in one pandemic, in less than 2 years. The British colonial administration's response to the pandemic in India was constrained by overlapping failures that reinforced each other catastrophically. The existing public health infrastructure was designed primarily to manage cholera and plague, diseases that are transmitted differently and respond to different interventions.
The colonial medical system was dramatically understaffed relative to the population it nominally served. Approximately 4,000 registered medical practitioners for 300 million people in 1918, and most of those practitioners concentrated in the cities where the colonial administration was headquartered, while the majority of the Indian population lived in rural areas that a physician might visit once a year, or once a decade, or never. The second layer of vulnerability was nutritional. 1918 was a year of monsoon failure in several major agricultural regions of India. Food prices had also been elevated by wartime requisitioning of grain supplies for the British military effort. Populations that arrive at an influenza pandemic in a state of nutritional compromise are more susceptible to severe outcomes.
The virus found bodies with less to draw on. The third layer, and perhaps the most consequential for the speed of spread, was the war itself. India's contribution to the British war effort between 1914 and 1918 had been enormous. Approximately 1.5 million soldiers and laborers recruited or pressed into service, transported to fronts in Mesopotamia, Palestine, East Africa, Gallipoli, and France. The movement of these men, their recruitment, their training in concentrated camps, their transport via crowded troop ships and transit depots, and eventually their return home carrying whatever they had contracted in those environments, created the ideal conditions for infectious disease transmission on a continental scale. The virus did not care about the British Empire.
It moved through its infrastructure as efficiently as troops moved through it, using the same routes, the same ships, the same railway lines. The same network that made the empire function made the pandemic spread. In the province of Punjab, which was one of the primary recruiting grounds for the Indian Army, and therefore one of the most disrupted by the war, mortality rates in October and November of 1918 reached levels that effectively dismantled entire village communities. Local records from some districts show that 1/3 of all deaths recorded in the entire year, 1918, occurred in a period of 8 weeks.
The administrative machinery of villages, the headmen, the tax collectors, the local authorities who maintained the records, was itself disrupted because the people who comprised that machinery were dying. The ordinary structures of death, The ceremonies that every human culture has developed across millennia to make mortality comprehensible, to separate the dead from the living, to allow the living to grieve in a form that other living people can witness and participate in. Those structures broke down when the dying came too fast for ritual to absorb. Bodies were not prepared properly because there was no one left to prepare them. Ceremonies were shortened or omitted because the mourners were sick or dead themselves.
The dead accumulated faster than the normal social processes of death could manage. The grief was not processed. It was survived. On the other side of the world, in a location so remote that its name was unknown to all but the most specialized cartographers outside Alaska, a village called Brevig Mission faced a different version of the same catastrophe. Brevig Mission sat on the Seward Peninsula, the westernmost finger of Alaska, pointing toward Russia across the Bering Strait.
In 1918, it was an Inuit settlement of approximately 80 adults, a small, tight community that had existed in that particular arrangement of coastline and tundra for generations, maintaining the knowledge systems and social structures that allowed human life to sustain itself in an environment where winter temperatures could fall to -40 degrees, and the sea ice was simultaneously a highway, a hunting ground, and a threat. The community was, in most respects, profoundly isolated from the industrialized world. They traded with occasional supply ships. They received mail by dog sled. They had some contact with Christian missionaries who had established a presence in the region in the late 19th century.
But the pathogens that circulated through American and European cities had limited pathways to reach a community that received visitors so rarely. A dog sled brought the virus. That is the mechanism, as best as historical reconstruction allows. A mail route. A routine delivery. Someone who did not know they were sick, or who knew and had no viable alternative because dog sled routes in 1918 were not easily rerouted on short notice, passed through Brevig Mission, carrying an infectious disease that the community's immune systems had no prior context for. Within 5 days, 80 of Brevig Mission's approximately 80 adults were dead. 5 people survived the outbreak in the village. The 5 survivors were children.
Why children survived in a virus that elsewhere demonstrated such particular lethality toward young adults in the prime of health remains, even now, not fully explained. Children in 1918 were somewhat protected by the specific immunological dynamics of the H1N1 virus, possibly because they had not accumulated prior immunity to earlier influenza strains that paradoxically made the immune response of experienced immune systems more destructively overactive. Or the 5 survived by chance, or by some combination of factors that cannot be fully isolated. The 5 children were found by a missionary relief party from a neighboring settlement who had come to check on the village after communications went silent. The adults around the children were all dead.
The relief party buried the dead in a mass grave in the permafrost, which was the practical choice given the conditions and the numbers, and a choice that would become scientifically significant 80 years later when researchers understood that permafrost preservation might have kept viral RNA fragments recoverable. But that is the future. In 1918, Breivik Mission was simply one of hundreds of indigenous communities across Alaska, northern Canada, and the subarctic territories of Russia and Scandinavia that the virus reached via the supply routes that connected them, however thinly, to the industrialized world. In many of these communities, death rates reached levels that have no equivalent in the pandemic experience of cities and nations.
The isolation that had protected these communities from so many previous diseases of the industrialized world could not hold against a virus that traveled by mail sled. The distance that had been a shield became, when the connection was finally made, an accelerant. Communities with no prior exposure, no partial immunity, no capacity to quickly modify their living arrangements or access medical care, experienced the virus all at once, without any of the buffers that even the overwhelmed cities of the eastern United States possessed. In the Pacific, Western Samoa lost approximately 22% of its total population in 6 weeks. Not 22% of the elderly, or the sick, or the vulnerable. 22% of everyone, of the entire living population of the islands.
The figure is disputed by some historians who argue the records are imprecise, but the range of serious estimates clusters around 1/5 to 1/4 of the population. Meanwhile, the neighboring island group of American Samoa, administered by the United States Navy, lost essentially no one. The naval governor, John Martin Poyer, had imposed a strict maritime quarantine when he received news of the pandemic's approach. Ships were required to stand off the harbor for an extended quarantine period before any passengers or cargo were allowed ashore. When a ship with sick passengers arrived, it was refused entry entirely. The quarantine held. The virus never established itself in American Samoa. 2 island groups in the same ocean.
The same climate, the same population genetics, the same general vulnerability to respiratory infections. One lost 1/5 of its people. One lost essentially no one. The difference was a single administrative decision by a single naval officer, maintained rigorously against the pressure of commercial shipping interests that wanted the quarantine lifted. The virus followed human decisions. Everywhere you look in the 1918 pandemic, behind the numbers, behind the case counts and the death rates, you find the imprint of choices made by people with authority over who could travel, who would receive care, who would be warned, who would be left to manage as best they could.
In Iran, between 1 and 2 million people died, in a country already destabilized by the presence of both British and Russian military forces on its territory, by the disruption to agricultural systems that military presence causes, and by a series of preceding famines that had left significant portions of the population in compromised nutritional states. In South Africa, the virus arrived in September of 1918 on a troop ship from Sierra Leone, disembarking at Cape Town, and spread through the mining compounds of the Witwatersrand, where black laborers from multiple regions of southern Africa worked in conditions of extreme density. Men sleeping in barracks arranged to maximize the number of bodies per square foot, sharing washing facilities, sharing eating areas, sharing the air. The death rates in these compounds were dramatically higher than in the white population of South Africa. This disparity was not a biological fact about race. It was a social fact about the living conditions that a racially organized economy imposed on a particular category of laborer. In Japan, nearly 400,000 people died, in a country that had initially responded to early reports of the disease with a degree of official complacency rooted in the belief that Western nations' susceptibility to the epidemic was a sign of their weakness, and that Japan, with its tradition of medical modernization, would be spared.
The pandemic did not acknowledge Japanese exceptionalism any more than it acknowledged British imperial authority or American municipal pride.
The distribution of death in 1918 followed existing lines of inequality with such consistency that it amounts to a kind of measurement. The pandemic did not create poverty or colonial disadvantage or racial hierarchy. It found those structures already in place and moved through them, killing at higher rates where the structures had already removed the resources, the food, the space, the medical care, the political representation that survival requires. This was the first pandemic in the age of modern globalization. Not because the world had never before connected distant populations. Trade routes had done that for millennia, and disease had always followed those routes. But 1918 was the first pandemic in the age of the railroad, the steamship, the telegraph, and the mass mobilization of millions of soldiers across multiple continents simultaneously. These technologies compressed the world into a space where a virus that emerged in Kansas or France or China in March could be simultaneously killing people in Alaska and India, and Western Samoa and South Africa by October. Every technology that connected the world in 1918 also transmitted what moved through that world. The railroad that carried medicine could carry the thing medicine could not yet treat. The steamship that brought soldiers home from the war brought what some of those soldiers had contracted aboard ship or in the trenches.
The telegraph that allowed cities to coordinate relief efforts was slower than the virus that the relief was meant to address. We built a world in which everything moves quickly. We had not yet fully understood that this included death. The second wave peaked in October of 1918 and began, like a tide that has reached its highest point, to pull back. In November, the armistice was signed on the Western Front. The guns of 4 years fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and the silence was itself disorienting. Soldiers on both sides described not knowing what the absence of artillery sound meant after years in which it had been the constant background of existence. The silence meant the war was over. People poured into the streets of London, Paris, New York, Sydney, Rome, and dozens of smaller cities and towns, celebrating an end that had seemed, at many points in the preceding 4 years, genuinely unachievable. There were parades.
There was drinking. There was weeping in the open air, in a way that the stoicism demanded by wartime had suppressed for years. Strangers embraced. People who had not smiled in months found themselves smiling. The virus moved through those crowds too. It had not agreed to the terms of the armistice. The celebrations of November of 1918, the gatherings, the crowds, the close proximity of people who had been told that the immediate crisis was receding, contributed to the beginning of what epidemiologists identify as the third wave, which arrived in the winter of 1918 to 1919 and moved through populations that were already exhausted, already grieving, already depleted by the preceding months. The third wave was less lethal than the second.
This finding is consistent across the countries and regions where records were kept carefully enough to support comparison. It killed fewer people per infection, and it spread somewhat less explosively. The explanations offered by epidemiologists and immunologists include several interacting factors. A portion of the global population had survived the second wave and carried some degree of immunity. The virus itself may have been undergoing further mutation in directions that reduced its virulence without eliminating its transmissibility. And human behavior had adapted in ways large and small. People who had watched their neighbors and family members die in October and November of 1918 understood, at a visceral level, the value of distance and ventilation in a way that public health messaging alone
could not have conveyed.
But less lethal than the second wave was not the same thing as harmless. The third wave killed in the hundreds of thousands across multiple continents. It simply killed them more slowly, in numbers that strained health systems already damaged, rather than overwhelming them completely. In April of 1919, as the third wave was still circulating through European populations, the Paris Peace Conference was entering its most consequential phase. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, had traveled to Paris as the representative of the only major power that had entered the war late enough to emerge from it with its territory and economy relatively intact.
Wilson arrived in Paris in January of 1919 as a kind of moral authority, the author of the 14 Points, the proponent of a League of Nations, the man who had articulated a vision for the post-war order that was explicitly anti-imperialist, explicitly oriented toward self-determination, explicitly designed to make this the war that ended wars. Wilson was the dominant personality in the early weeks of the conference. He possessed the intellectual stamina and the detailed command of his positions that complex multilateral negotiation requires. His colleagues and staff in Paris described him as formidably focused, difficult to deflect once he had decided on a position, capable of sustaining the pressure of extended negotiation sessions without losing the thread. In early April of 1919, Wilson collapsed.
His personal physician, Cary Grayson, described the illness at the time as a severe cold. The symptoms Grayson recorded, and those described by Wilson's aides and fellow delegates in contemporaneous diary entries and letters, were consistent with influenza. Sudden high fever, violent coughing episodes, gastrointestinal distress severe enough to prevent him from working for several days, and, most significantly, in retrospect, a marked change in cognitive and behavioral presentation that persisted after the acute illness appeared to subside. Herbert Hoover, who was present at the Paris conference in his capacity coordinating European food relief, wrote in his memoir that the Wilson he observed in the weeks following the April illness seemed like a different person from the Wilson he had known earlier in the conference.
More rigid in some respects, more prone to sudden capitulations in others, less able to maintain the sustained argumentative pressure that his position had previously allowed him to exert. The neurologist Edwin Weinstein examined the historical record decades later and argued that Wilson suffered a mild but clinically significant stroke either during or shortly after the influenza episode in April. Other medical historians have argued that the cognitive changes were attributable to post-viral syndrome, the prolonged neurological effects that severe influenza can produce, including what we now recognize as brain fog, difficulty with complex reasoning, and emotional lability. The debate has not been fully resolved and may not be resolvable given the available evidence. What is resolvable is what the Treaty of Versailles contained. The treaty signed in June of 1919 was not the treaty Wilson had come to Paris to negotiate. The punitive war guilt clause, the reparations calculated to impoverish Germany for a generation, the territorial losses designed to humiliate rather than to stabilize. These were provisions that Wilson had explicitly and publicly opposed in earlier phases of the negotiation, provisions he had repeatedly characterized as incompatible with a durable peace. And yet, the treaty contained them, and Wilson's resistance to them collapsed in the final weeks of negotiation. The degree to which this collapse was caused by the April illness is genuinely uncertain.
The political forces aligned against Wilson's program, the French government's determination to extract maximal compensation, the British government's domestic political pressures, The systemic difficulty of maintaining an idealistic framework against the revenge seeking of nations that had watched their young men die in the mud for 4 years. Those forces were real and powerful, and they might have overcome Wilson's resistance regardless of his health. But the possibility exists.
The possibility, which some historians take seriously and others dismiss, that a virus present in a Parisian apartment in April of 1919 altered the cognitive state of the man who might otherwise have produced a different treaty, and that the different treaty might have produced a different Germany in the 1920s and 30s. That possibility is not historical certainty. It is a ghost in the archive. What we know with certainty is what the actual treaty produced. The resentment it generated became the soil in which the National Socialist movement grew. The economic consequences of the reparations created the conditions of hyperinflation and political instability that allowed extremism to become plausible.
The humiliation encoded in the War Guilt Clause generated a political energy that found its outlet 20 years later. If the virus was present in that causal chain, even as a minor contributing factor, then the 1918 influenza pandemic is connected not only to its own approximately 50 to 100 million dead, but to what followed from the peace that ended the war it accompanied. Disease does not stand outside history and observe it. It enters history through the bodies of the people who are making decisions, and it makes different decisions possible. By 1920, the pandemic was effectively over. This ending is itself strange and poorly understood. Influenza pandemics do not end cleanly, through the mechanism of herd immunity that stops a measles outbreak or eradicates a polio transmission chain. The 1918 virus did not disappear when enough people had been infected to theoretically block its transmission. It moved instead from pandemic to endemic. It transitioned from an acute catastrophic event into the seasonal influenza that circulates every winter. The disease that kills tens of thousands of people every year in the United States alone, and that we have come to regard, despite those numbers, as ordinary. The virus became background noise. The total death count remains contested at the margins, but not in its broad outlines.
Early estimates, made in the years immediately following 1918 with the data then available, cited 20 to 40 million dead. These estimates were based primarily on European and North American records, with significant gaps in Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and Latin America. As demographic historians revisited the numbers across the 20th century and applied improved excess mortality modeling to newly discovered records, the estimates climbed. By the early 2000s, the most rigorous analyses placed the death toll at a minimum of 50 million and potentially as high as 100 million. 50 million is the entire population of England and Ireland combined in 1918. 100 million is a number that does not fit neatly inside ordinary comprehension.
It is more people than the First World War killed, more than the Second World War killed. It may be more than both combined. In roughly 12 months of acute intensity, the 1918 influenza killed more human beings than any other disease event in recorded history, with the possible exception of the Black Death of the 14th century, and possibly more than that as well, depending on which estimates you accept for the plague's toll and how you account for the dramatically smaller global population of the medieval world.
The First World War, with 4 years of industrialized violence, trench warfare, poison gas, artillery barrages that could be heard across the Channel, aerial bombardment, naval blockades, the deliberate starvation of civilian populations. All of it together killed approximately 17 million people. The pandemic killed 3 times that, possibly 5 times.
in less time. Without declarations of war or strategic objectives, or the concentrated collective violence of nation-states aimed at each other. With nothing but a strand of RNA 8 genes long, replicating itself inside respiratory cells, one generation every few hours, adapting without intention toward forms that the human immune system had not learned to recognize. The war had monuments.
It had the tomb of the unknown soldier, reproduced in national capitals across the world. Paris, London, Washington, Rome, Brussels, Warsaw. A conscious and sustained architectural effort to make absence visible, to give the unidentifiable dead a place that the living could stand before and acknowledge. The war had memorial poetry that entered the literary canon. It had Armistice Day observed annually in solemn public ceremony. It had textbooks, films, museums, official histories commissioned by governments. It had the deliberate, sustained work of collective memory. The pandemic had almost none of this. The dead of the flu were buried in the autumn weeks, when individual funerals were impossible, many of them in mass graves, some of them in unmarked locations.
Their names appear in ledgers and later in digitized databases maintained by epidemiologists and genealogists. Their stories were told privately, within families, and then not told at all as the families aged and the specific memories attached to specific names dissolved into the undifferentiated past. Historians of collective memory have observed that societies are better equipped to mourn deaths that can be attributed to human agency, deaths caused by an identifiable enemy, a nameable decision, a system that can be described and blamed and potentially prosecuted. The First World War offered those anchors, the generals, the governments, the political failures of 1914, the specific battles with specific commanders whose decisions sent specific men to die in specific fields. These can be argued about, condemned, commemorated, incorporated into narrative.
The flu offered none of that. It had Wilmer Cruzen, but Cruzen was a bureaucrat making a defensible, if catastrophic, calculation in conditions of genuine uncertainty, not a general knowingly ordering men into machine gun fire. It had the conditions of globalization and colonial inequality, but those were systems too diffuse and too old and too entangled with everything else to stand before as a singular cause. It had no villain whose portrait could be placed in a museum and marked with a date. So the pandemic was set aside, not immediately and not completely. In the years immediately following 1918, there was some public discourse. Medical journals published analyses, a few memoirs appeared, some local public health reports attempted to document what had occurred.
But the 1920s arrived with an extraordinary cultural energy, the energy of people who had survived both a catastrophic war and a catastrophic plague, and wanted to dance in speakeasies and invest in booming markets and wear shorter skirts and drive fast cars and live forward into a future that felt, at least temporarily, like it might be different from what had come before. The forgetting was not a failure of compassion. It was the coping mechanism of a civilization that had been through too much too fast. Grief requires space and energy, and the willingness to remain with what is painful rather than moving past it. The 1920s did not have that space or that willingness to spare. Survival instinct directed attention toward the future.
The pandemic was absorbed and covered over, and for most of the 20th century, it was a footnote, a datum in a medical history textbook. the thing that killed more people than the Great War, and that almost no one talked about. Until scientists examining tissue samples in military pathology archives began asking why the 1918 virus was so immunologically unusual. Until the molecular biology of RNA viruses became sophisticated enough to ask questions about pandemic origins. Until new pandemics arrived and carried the genetic signatures of 1918 inside them, like a message written in a language no one had deciphered yet.
It had simply been waiting inside seasonal flu strains, inside migratory birds, inside swine populations on farms in the American Midwest, for conditions that might allow it to become once more what it had been in 1918. Whether those conditions would arrive again was not a question the 1920s wanted to ask. It was a question that the 21st century would be forced to answer. And then, like all pandemics, it ended. The world rebuilt, renamed it the Spanish flu, and moved on. It tried very hard to forget.
The world chose to forget. It buried the dead, burned the hospital linens, aired out the wards, and moved on. The armistice was signed. The soldiers came home. The newspapers turned their front pages to politics and recovery, and the cautious business of rebuilding a world that the war had broken into pieces. The pandemic slipped out of the headlines, out of the school textbooks, out of the public conversation. It was assigned no monument, no official day of mourning, no proper name of its own. They called it the Spanish flu, a name that blamed a neutral country for something that had nothing to do with Spain, and they left it at that. But the virus did not forget.
It had written itself into the immune memory of every survivor. It had left its genetic fingerprints in the bodies of those who died, preserved in formaldehyde locked in church records, frozen into the permafrost of the Arctic. It was waiting, in the way that dead things wait, for someone to come and look. That someone arrived 79 years later in a government laboratory in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. His name was Jeffrey Taubenberger. He was a pathologist at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, and in 1997 he published something that startled the scientific world. Fragments of the 1918 influenza virus, extracted from lung tissue samples that had been sitting in a military archive, preserved in formalin, untouched for nearly 8 decades.
The samples were from soldiers, young men who had died in the autumn of 1918, some within days of falling ill. Their lungs had been removed at autopsy, sliced into thin sections, embedded in wax blocks, and filed away in drawers. Not because anyone expected them to be useful, but because that was what military pathologists did. They documented. They preserved. They filed. Taubenberger's team developed techniques sensitive enough to extract RNA fragments from the degraded tissue. The samples were old and damaged, the genetic material broken into short, overlapping pieces. But the pieces were there. Enough to begin reconstruction. Enough to ask the question that the scientific community had been afraid to ask directly. What, exactly, had killed 50 million people? The preliminary answer was unsettling.
The virus was influenza A, type H1N1, the same broad family that causes seasonal flu every winter. But this version of it was different in ways that were not easy to explain. Its genes bore marks of avian origin, structural features typically found in bird flu viruses, not in the strains that circulate annually in humans. It was not, in other words, simply a bad flu. It was something that had crossed a boundary. Something that the human immune system had never encountered before and had no instructions for handling. But the archive samples were incomplete. The fragments were useful, but they were not the whole picture.
To reconstruct the full genome, to understand every protein, every surface structure, every mechanism by which the virus had killed, the scientists needed better material. They knew where to look. They had known for decades. In 1951, a virologist named Johann Holten had traveled to the village of Brevig Mission in Alaska. The same village that had lost nearly every one of its adult residents in a single week in November of 1918. The village sat on ground that was permanently frozen. Holten believed that the permafrost might have preserved viral material intact, suspended in the cold, through all the decades of forgetting. He found the mass grave. He excavated it with permission from the community.
He collected tissue samples, brought them back to his laboratory, and attempted to grow the virus. He failed. The technology of 1951 was not equal to the task. He put away his notes and moved on. He was 72 years old when he read Taubenberger's 1997 paper. He wrote a letter. He went back. With his own money, with tools he purchased at a hardware store in Anchorage, Johann Holten returned to Brevig Mission in the summer of 1997. He excavated again. And this time, in the permafrost, he found what he was looking for: the preserved lung tissue of a large woman whose body fat had insulated her organs through 79 winters, keeping them intact in a way that leaner bodies had not.
He named her, in his own notes, Lucy. He shipped the samples to Taubenberger's laboratory. And from Lucy's lungs, the team was able to extract genetic material that would change everything they thought they knew about the 1918 pandemic. By 2005, the complete genome of the 1918 influenza virus had been sequenced. By 2018, NIH researchers announced that approximately 80% of the virus's genetic sequence had been reconstructed from various archived samples. A picture detailed enough to begin building the virus in a laboratory. That is exactly what happened. Under the strictest containment conditions available to science, a biosafety level 4 laboratory, the same classification reserved for Ebola and smallpox. Researchers recreated the 1918 influenza virus.
Not as an historical curiosity, as an object of study. Because to understand how to stop the next pandemic, they believed they needed to understand exactly what had made this one so catastrophic. The experiments confirmed what the genetic data had suggested. The virus killed not only by infecting the lungs, but by triggering a massive and self-destructive immune response, what immunologists call a cytokine storm. The body's defenses, encountering something they had no map for, flooded the system with inflammatory signals, burning the lungs from the inside. In healthy young adults with vigorous immune systems, the response was especially violent. The very strength of their defenses made the damage worse. This was why the 1918 flu had inverted the normal pattern of death.
This was why it had killed more 25-year-olds than 70-year-olds. Not because it preferred the young, but because the young fought it hardest, and fighting it was, in the end, what killed them. The reconstruction also answered a question that had circled the edges of every previous study of the pandemic. Why had this particular virus been so different? The answer was written in its genes. The 1918 virus had acquired, through a process that is still not fully understood, a combination of surface proteins that allowed it to bind to receptors deep in the lower respiratory tract. Not just the upper airways, as most seasonal flu strains do. It went further into the lungs. It caused more profound damage.
And it did so at a speed that left the body's repair systems no time to respond. The reconstruction also revealed something sobering about the gap between what we can know and what we can prevent. Even with the complete genome in hand, even with the virus rebuilt and studied under every available instrument, the precise chain of events that allowed it to emerge from birds into humans in 1917 or 1918, the specific mutations, the specific host, the specific moment, cannot be reconstructed. We can read what it became. We cannot fully read how it came to be. That threshold between an animal virus and a pandemic one remains one of the most consequential unsolved problems in infectious disease science.
We dug up the dead to understand what they died of. We rebuilt the thing that killed them in a sealed room. We held it up to the light and looked at it from every angle. We had to, because it had not finished teaching us. Influenza does not disappear. This is the part that most histories leave out, or mention briefly in a final paragraph before moving on. The 1918 pandemic is treated as a closed chapter, a catastrophe with a beginning and an end, a story that concluded when the third wave faded in 1920 and the case counts finally dropped. But the virus that caused the 1918 pandemic did not die when the pandemic ended. It circulated. It mutated. It found its way into animals and out again. It swapped genetic material with other strains in the bodies of pigs and birds and humans who happened to be infected by more than one virus at once.
And it reappeared, not in exactly the same form, but carrying pieces of itself forward, like a signature that had been written over, but not entirely erased. The first major echo came in 1957. A new strain of influenza emerged in East Asia, designated H2N2, the Asian flu. It was not the same as the 1918 virus, but its genes showed clear evidence of recombination. Some components derived from the H1N1 lineage that had descended from 1918, hybridized with genes from a bird flu strain. The human immune system recognized parts of it, but not all of it. Not enough to mount an effective defense without assistance.
In the United States alone, roughly 80,000 deaths were attributed to it in less than a year. It moved quickly, spread through schools and military bases, and disproportionately affected the elderly and the very young, a more familiar death pattern than 1918, but still fast enough and still deadly enough to overwhelm unprepared health systems. 11 years later, it happened again. In 1968, the H3N2 strain emerged, the Hong Kong flu. Another reassortment, another hybrid. The H3N2 virus carried a hemagglutinin protein that was new enough to evade existing immunity
in most of the population, combined with a neuraminidase gene that the immune system had encountered before.
The result was a pandemic that was somewhat less deadly than 1957, because partial immunity blunted the worst outcomes, but still killed approximately 1 million people worldwide before it was contained. Researchers tracking the genetics of these strains identified something that at first seemed almost impossible. The 1968 H3N2 virus contained genetic contributions that could be traced through several generations of mutation and recombination back to the original 1918 H1N1 lineage. The pandemic that the world had tried to forget was still present, rearranged in the viruses that were killing people half a century later. And then came 2009.
The H1N1 pandemic of 2009, the one the newspapers called swine flu, was genetically distinct from the 1918 virus in many ways. But when researchers analyzed its genes, they found segments that shared ancestry with the 1918 strain. It had passed through pigs and through birds and back into humans, shuffled and recombined so many times that its family resemblance to the original was distant and complex. But it was there. The 2009 pandemic killed an estimated 280,000 people by the most conservative calculations, and possibly far more when accounting for underreporting in countries without robust health surveillance.
It moved fastest through young adults and children, populations who had never been exposed to the older H1N1 strains that provided partial protection to people who were elderly. The pattern was a diminished echo of 1918, played in the same key at lower volume. The influenza researchers who studied these outbreaks arrived, over decades of accumulated evidence, at a conclusion that sounds almost philosophical when you say it plainly. The H1N1 virus that caused the 1918 pandemic never stopped circulating. It changed. It diversified. It spread across species and recombined with dozens of other strains. But its descendants, carrying fragments of its genetic identity, are present in the seasonal influenza viruses that circulate every winter to this day.
When you get a flu shot, you are, in a distant but real sense, being vaccinated against a virus that first appeared in a barracks in Kansas in the spring of 1918. The virus has not ended. It has simply become part of the permanent background noise of human existence. The annual flu season, the yearly update to vaccine formulations, the respiratory illness that puts grandparents in the hospital every February. We learned to manage it. We built systems around it. We folded it into the calendar. But we did not defeat it. We reached a kind of accommodation, the way that cities reach an accommodation with rivers. We learned the flood patterns. We built the levees. We accepted that the water would always be there.
There is a particular strangeness to this inheritance. The survivors of 1918 were, biologically speaking, the lucky ones, those whose immune systems had managed to clear the infection without killing them in the process. Their descendants carry, in their immune profiles, faint echoes of that encounter, antibodies shaped by exposure to a virus that no longer exists in its original form. And the virus itself, transformed and dispersed across 100 species and 100 years, carries forward the genetic logic of what it once was. The 1918 pandemic did not end. It dissolved into history, and history dissolved into the present. The disease did not end. It retreated into the background. And it waits, as diseases wait, for the conditions that will bring it forward again.
Before 1918,
There was no such thing as a public health system in the modern sense of the term. There were hospitals. There were medical schools. There were local boards of health in large cities, mostly concerned with sanitation, water quality, sewage disposal, the containment of typhoid and cholera, the recurring nightmares of the 19th century. There were a handful of national health agencies, understaffed and underfunded, with no authority to coordinate responses across borders. There was no international disease surveillance network. There was no established protocol for quarantine at the global level. There was no rapid communication system linking doctors in Bombay to doctors in Boston.
By the time the warning arrived, so had the virus. The 1918 pandemic revealed, in the most catastrophic way possible, exactly how fragile these arrangements were. Cities that had attempted to suppress information about the epidemic, to avoid panic, to maintain the war effort, to preserve the illusion of normalcy, suffered greater mortality than cities that had acted quickly and openly. The suppression of information, which governments across the world had practiced as a matter of wartime policy, turned out to be, from a public health standpoint, simply another way of killing people. Slower, but just as effective. The lesson was not immediately learned. The institutional response was halting and uneven, as institutional responses to catastrophe almost always are.
But the pandemic had made the argument that words and political will had failed to make. That infectious disease crossed every border, ignored every alliance, and could not be managed by individual nations acting alone. In 1919, the year the pandemic formally ended, the International Health Organization was established in Vienna as part of the League of Nations framework. The first true attempt at a coordinated global health body. It was inadequate from the start, underfunded and given authority over little more than reporting. But it existed. The principle had been established that human health was a matter for international governance, not only local administration. Over the following decades, this principle slowly acquired institutional form. The World Health Organization was established in 1948.
Its global influenza surveillance and response system, the network that monitors flu strains circulating in every country, predicts which variants will be dominant in each hemisphere's winter season, and issues recommendations for annual vaccine formulations. Began operating in 1952 and continues to function today, collecting samples from laboratories in over 110 countries, analyzed by reference centers on 6 continents. Every year in February, a committee of scientists convenes under the WHO's auspices to decide which influenza strains should be included in the coming winter's vaccine. They are making an educated prediction based on 6 months of surveillance data about which viruses are most likely to spread across the northern hemisphere in the season ahead. They are often not entirely right.
The virus is a moving target, but the infrastructure that allows them to make the attempt at all, the surveillance, the reporting, the rapid sequencing, the international coordination, was built on the ruins of 1918. The pandemic also changed medicine at the level of clinical practice. Before 1918, quarantine was inconsistently practiced and poorly understood as a tool of epidemic control. The pandemic provided, across dozens of cities and countries, a kind of brutal natural experiment in which some communities implemented strict social distancing measures banning public gatherings, closing schools, requiring masks in public, and others did not. The cities that acted early and comprehensively had measurably lower death rates.
The comparison was stark enough that even skeptical administrators could see it in the numbers. The evidence was not ignored. In the years following the pandemic, the protocols for responding to epidemic disease were systematized in ways they had not been before. Quarantine stations became more organized. Reporting requirements became more standardized. The understanding that population-level interventions, not just individual medical treatment, were essential tools of epidemic management moved from the margins of public health theory to its center. The flu vaccine came later, and more slowly, than the public health reforms. Influenza was not confirmed as a viral disease until 1933, when the British virologist Wilson Smith isolated the influenza A virus in ferrets.
The first experimental flu vaccines were tested in military populations in the late 1930s and early 40s. By 1945, the United States Army had licensed the first flu vaccine for military use. That vaccine was crude by modern standards. It provided limited protection against a limited range of strains. But it worked. It was built on the understanding, developed through years of painstaking research that had begun with samples taken from 1918 victims, of how the influenza virus was structured, how the immune system responded to it, and what kind of antigen would teach the immune system to recognize and fight it. The 1918 pandemic killed 50 million people.
Its legacy, measured in the institutions and protocols that rose from its wreckage, has since saved an uncountable number more. This is not a comfortable fact. It has the quality of a dark arithmetic, the suggestion that catastrophe earns its place by forcing the changes that should have been made before the catastrophe arrived. We prefer the idea that wisdom precedes disaster, that institutions are built because intelligent people foresee what might happen, rather than because something already has. The history of pandemic medicine does not entirely support this preference. What the pandemic taught us, we learned the hard way. The students were the survivors, and the curriculum was the counting of the dead.
The examination was every outbreak that followed, and the grade was measured in lives rather than scores. Our best medical institutions were not built in spite of the worst disasters. They were built because of them. Every protocol, every vaccine program, every international surveillance network carries, somewhere in its foundations, the weight of the people who died before the lesson was understood. The pandemic also changed how doctors thought about death itself. Before 1918, the dominant framework for understanding epidemic mortality focused on the individual, on personal hygiene, on individual susceptibility, on the moral dimensions of disease that had persisted in various forms, since the medieval understanding of plague as divine punishment. The 1918 pandemic made it impossible to maintain this framework. It struck the clean and the filthy, the devout and the secular, the careful and the reckless, with an indifference that was its own kind of argument. It was not a judgment, it was a biological event, and biological events required biological responses, not moral ones. This shift from a moralized understanding of disease to an epidemiological one was not immediate and was not complete. The stigma that surrounded the pandemic, even as it was happening, the shame that kept families from naming it on headstones, reflected how deeply the old framework persisted. But the scientific institutions that emerged from 1918 were built on the new framework.
They were built on the understanding that disease did not choose its victims on the basis of merit, and that protecting populations required thinking about populations, not just individuals. That is the price at which modern medicine was purchased.
In the cemeteries of 1918 and 1919, the headstones tell a particular kind of story, not with words, with their silence. Many of the graves from that period carry no cause of death. The date of birth, the date of death, perhaps a name or a brief epitaph. Beloved husband, loving mother, taken too soon, and nothing else. The pandemic itself goes unmentioned, not from ignorance, not from modesty, from something that at the time felt more like shame. There was a social stigma attached to dying of the flu in the autumn of 1918.
The disease moved with such speed and brutality, leaving such visible marks. The cyanosis that turned faces blue and gray before death, the blood-tinged fluid that could be heard in the lungs, that even the dying were sometimes treated with a distance that went beyond the practical requirements of infection control. Families hesitated to tell neighbors what their loved one had died of. Communities moved to bury the dead and return to ordinary life with a haste that was partly practical and partly something else. Something that wanted very much not to look directly at what had happened. The grief of 1918 was also complicated by geography and timing in ways that made it peculiarly difficult to hold.
The pandemic arrived at the end of a war that had already consumed years of grief. Millions of families were already mourning sons and brothers and husbands who had died in France, in the muddy trenches, in the hospitals that smelled of gangrene and morphine. The armistice of November 11th, 1918, the end of the war, arrived in the middle of the second wave's worst weeks. The celebrations and the funerals were simultaneous. The church bells rang for victory and for the dead at the same time. How do you hold both things at once? How do you celebrate the end of one catastrophe while you are still in the middle of another? Many people apparently could not.
The pandemic was set aside, emotionally, to be processed later, and later never entirely came. The survivors moved on. They had to. The economy needed workers. The farms needed hands. The children needed parents. The ordinary machinery of daily life demanded to be operated, and operating it left little space for sustained public mourning, of the kind that wars receive. Wars get monuments. Wars get anniversaries. Wars get films and novels, and official commemorations, national days of remembrance, white poppies and red ones, the eternal flame, the tomb of the unknown soldier. The pandemic got none of these things.
For most of the 20th century, the 1918 influenza pandemic occupied a curious position in collective memory, something that everyone who had lived through it remembered with horror, and that everyone who had only read about it barely remembered at all. It was taught in medical schools, studied in epidemiology departments, referenced in papers about pandemic preparedness. But in the broader cultural memory, in the way that wars and famines and disasters are remembered, embedded in stories and monuments and shared language, it was almost entirely absent. There is a word for this kind of forgetting. Historians call it collective amnesia, and it is not the same as not knowing. The people who lived through 1918 knew perfectly well what had happened.
They had watched their neighbors die. They had carried coffins. They had held children who stopped breathing before morning. They knew. They simply found in the years that followed that they did not want to speak of it, and that no one around them particularly wanted to ask. This was not unique to any one country. In the United States, in Britain, in France, in India, in South Africa, the pandemic disappeared from public discourse with a speed that historians have found genuinely puzzling.
It is as if an entire civilization, wounded in two places at once by war and by disease, could only handle the grief of one, and chose the war, the grief with a clear villain, a clear cause, a clear shape, and put the other down somewhere, and forgot to pick it back up. The individual memories persisted. People told their children and grandchildren what they had seen. Oral histories collected decades later revealed extraordinary detail: the smell of the wards, the color of the dying, the sound of the coffin wagons in the street at night, the particular quality of the silence that fell over a neighborhood when a family was struck. These memories were vivid and specific, and often agonizing.
They lived inside families, inside the minds of aging survivors, inside journals that were kept in drawers and not published. They did not become part of the public story that a society tells itself about what happened to it and what it means. It was not until 2003, when the SARS outbreak reminded a new generation of policymakers that respiratory pandemics were not a historical novelty, but a recurring feature of human existence, that serious historical attention began to return to 1918. And it was not until 2020, when COVID-19 spread across the world in the familiar pattern, that the 1918 pandemic finally entered the broad public conversation again. Suddenly, the comparisons were everywhere.
The mask debates of 1918 were cited alongside the mask debates of 2020. The city of Philadelphia's failed Liberty Loan Parade was held up as a warning. The question of whether to cancel public gatherings, which had been argued in newsrooms and city halls in the autumn of 1918, was being argued in the same terms, in the same kinds of rooms, 102 years later. The pandemic had not been forgotten, it turned out. It had only been waiting, preserved in the archives, in the frozen ground of Alaska, in the wax block tissue samples in government drawers, for the moment when it would be needed again.
For the moment when the world would once again need to understand what it was facing, and would turn, however reluctantly, to the record of what had come before. There was something almost unbearable about this return. The writers and historians and documentary filmmakers who rediscovered the 1918 pandemic in the early months of 2020 were not bringing it back to life. They were revealing that it had never fully died. The same arguments about masks and mandates, about economic disruption and public gatherings, about whose duty it was to protect whom, had been made in the autumn of 1918 with identical urgency and identical frustration, by people who also believed that their situation was unprecedented. It was not unprecedented.
It had happened before, in living memory, and the memory had simply not been preserved in a form that the present could easily access. But the grief, the specific, personal, particular grief of the individuals who died and the people who loved them, that did not come back with the historical attention. That part remained buried. The statistics were recovered. The genetic sequences were reconstructed. The policy debates were relitigated.
But the faces behind the numbers, the Lucy in the permafrost, the young soldier whose lungs were preserved in formalin and then filed in a drawer for 80 years, the father who died in Philadelphia in October of 1918 while his city was holding a parade. They remained, as they had always been, individual and unreachable. 50 million deaths is not a number that can be held. It is too large for any single mind to contain. It becomes, inevitably, a statistic, a figure cited in papers, compared to other figures, analyzed for what it reveals about the virus and the century and the failures of public health policy.
But behind each unit of that number was one particular death, in one particular room, on one particular night, with one particular person sitting beside the bed or not sitting there because they were sick themselves, or because the door had been closed to prevent contagion, or because there was no one left to sit there. That is the scale that the history books cannot render. That is the grief that the monuments were never built to hold. That is the weight of what happened, reduced to 5 digits and 2 commas, when in reality it was 100 million separate experiences of loss. 100 million instances of someone learning that the person they had expected to grow old beside was gone. The pandemic ended. The statistics closed.
The archives were sealed. The wards were cleared and returned to their ordinary purposes. The world rebuilt itself, imperfectly, around the empty spaces left by the dead. The influenza A H1N1 virus, descended from the 1918 strain, is still circulating today. In every flu season, in every country where seasonal influenza is tracked, it reappears in some form, mutated, diluted, changed beyond easy recognition, but carrying forward the genetic inheritance of what emerged from a Kansas barracks in the cold early days of March 1918. It moves through populations, infects the susceptible, kills the unlucky few, and continues. It has been circulating for over 100 years. The people it killed in 1918 are gone beyond any possibility of recovery.
Their names have faded from the collective memory. Their grief has mostly been absorbed into the general background weight of the 20th century, folded into the casualty lists of a world that suffered too much in too short a time to properly account for any single disaster. But they died. Each one of them, individually, died. And the people who loved them carried that specific grief through the rest of their lives, quietly, mostly, without monuments or official commemorations, without anyone particularly asking what it had been like. There is something worth sitting with in that silence. Not every grief gets a name. Not every catastrophe gets a proper memorial.
Some of the largest events in human history have been absorbed into the background of daily life and carried forward not in stone or ceremony, but in the small changes they made to the world, in the institutions they forced into existence, in the habits of caution they installed in health systems, in the vaccine programs they made possible, in the particular worriness that now lives in the protocols of every public health authority on earth. The grief was not marked, but the world it made is everywhere around us. The pandemic ended. The grief did not.